Video game. Noun. A game played by electronically manipulating images produced by a computer program on a television screen or display. Every single one of you has most likely played a video game in some capacity at this point, or at least heard of them. Games like Call of Duty and Skyrim have sold billions of copies, so thoroughly permeated our culture that one can easily find daily reference to them in casual conversation. And nowhere has this blossoming medium had more profound effects than in Japan, where the creation and expansion of the video game market contributed to economic booms, the adoption of Western cultural aspects, and the widespread development of new entertainment technology. So let's get started then. First, a brief recap. The first video game was invented in America in 1958 by William Higginbottom. It was called Tennis for Two, though you know it as Pong. Following this, companies such as Magnavox and Atari, American companies, brought the game into the home. However, every game that was released since then was Pong. Naturally, people stopped buying games and the companies failed. Enter Japan. In 1983, a toy company called Nintendo decided to continue the modern Japanese trend of adopting American things and then doing them way better when it released the Family Computer, or Famicom for short. It used the same technology as the Atari 2600, but with a huge variety of games produced by other Japanese companies, making it ship about 63 million units in its first fiscal year. Now, if you know your history, you know that Japan has traditionally profited on an export-based model, and that following the post-World War II occupation of Japan by the United States, the nation was in a state of recovery. In order to accelerate this recovery, the Japanese government mandated a series of education reforms that gave Japan the highest literacy rates in the world and enabled it to have a very technology-heavy industry, as the amount of smart people able to make electronics such as the Famicom skyrocketed. The nation adopted the Tiger economic model, thriving off exports without falling into debt. Electronics, such as the Famicom, made up 15% of these exports. Now, obviously, the Famicom's release worked out great in Japan, as game companies like Nintendo and Sega grew and grew, allowing for more jobs and middle-class growth. But the whole export-based thing wasn't really working. Why? Because Americans were still hugely unenthusiastic about games because their experiences with games went somewhat like this. Yeah. And as unbelievable as it may seem, American citizens weren't too keen on buying Japanese games. They were unfamiliar, odd, and they were very poorly translated. So how did Japanese companies turn games into the smash global success they are today? By adapting. Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES for short, in 1985 everywhere, and the system and the games on it sold huge numbers, even in America. Why? Because Nintendo, Sega, Capcom, etc. remembered the mistakes of American companies, but at the same time realized that American consumers were more likely to buy games that struck a familiar chord. So the NES saw games such as Super Mario Bros., a game about an Italian plumber going through the common Western tale of rescuing the princess, The Legend of Zelda, an adventure game featuring Western fantasy themes, and Contra, a game in which you control a shirtless American commando going absolutely bananas on mercenaries in New Zealand. Games based on sports traditionally popular in America, such as Punch-Out!, Tecmo Super Bowl, and the very creatively named baseball, were met with widespread success not only overseas, but in Japan as well. People in Japan were both making and buying these games that were so dependent on emulating non-Japanese culture. Perhaps the single best example, and this leads into the new technology as well, is Tetris. You see, back in 1989, Nintendo had developed a whole new way to play games, a portable device called the Game Boy. People could carry it around everywhere and play as long as they had batteries. However, the smaller size meant it couldn't process as fast and everything was in black and white, so it wasn't too popular. Then, Nintendo bundled it with a game called Tetris, a Russian puzzle game. Sure enough, the Game Boy became the best-selling piece of gaming technology of all time. And really, who here doesn't know what Tetris is? Thanks to Tetris, the Game Boy was a smash hit, and other Japanese companies tried to catch up to Nintendo's trailblazing. Sega released the Game Gear in 1991, bundled with NBA Jam, again a Japanese game based entirely on American culture. This competition would lead to Nintendo and Sega each improving on their handhelds, giving us the Game Boy Color, Advance, the Nintendo DS, which featured online capabilities and touchscreen technology, and most recently the Nintendo 3DS, which utilizes 3D images without the use of 3D glasses. This competition was evident in the home console market as well. Nintendo and Sega dueled head-to-head with the Genesis and Super Nintendo systems until the 1995 release of the Sony PlayStation pushed both to develop 3D games, with the Nintendo 64 and Sega Saturn. Japanese companies would continue to dominate the video game market until the 2000s, when an American company, Microsoft, used the technology developed by Japanese companies to make a new and improved console, the Xbox, featuring internet services that allowed people to play games together online. This was a smash hit in the United States, leaving Japanese competitors struggling overseas until Nintendo released the Wii in 2006, which utilized motion control to target a much broader family demographic. So, to sum it all up, since the 1983 crash of American game companies, the Japanese game market has prospered and flourished, contributing to the nation's post-World War II economic recovery, and led to the increased influence of outside cultures on Japanese products and home life, while also creating new and improved technology for widespread domestic use. While one would be correct in saying that video games started with Pong, or even the cathode ray tube patent in 1947, the medium as it is today would not exist without Japan's resourceful adaptations to a global market.